So he would go buy 10 Cadillacs. He would go buy 10 Mercedes-Benz, and the bills would come in. And all the money he'd earned from royalties and from personal appearances or whatever it was would be gone plus 100. And then a movie would come in. Now they were a lot of conversations where Vernon Presley would call and I'd answer the phone, and Vernon would say, "Hey Greg, tell the Colonel we need $100,000. I said, "Why don't you talk to him? He's here." Well, Vernon didn't want to talk to the Colonel, so I'll tell him. I tell the Colonel, and the Colonel just put his head down on his desk and say, "We just sent him $200,000." And this is how it went on for year after year after year. And we loved Elvis. And his heart, it was hard to believe that if he knew it was going to hurt him, he would have still given that away. He would have still shared with those people. I knew he would. And also, you could never walk up to Elvis Presley like people think you could. He was the biggest star in the world. You can't walk up to him and say, "Don't spend your money." You'll be out the door on your head. Just did people, even the Colonel with his relationship. Nobody had that kind of a relationship with Elvis that they could say, "We think you're doing too much of this or too much of that," and it was possible. So some of these decisions that you look at now and go, why did they do that movie? Why did they do that song? And we were having conference room tables about the creative piece of that. We were talking about how much cash we were going to get in and when did we get the deposit, because we had to make a bank deposit. It wasn't about the movie. And everybody makes these grand decisions about career. We had to get City National Bank and Planters Bank in Memphis covered. It sounds terrible because it was Elvis Presley. I never knew, except maybe once or twice, that Elvis ever accrued $1 million. He spent it. The Colonel was just as bad. The Colonel liked to play. Everybody knows that there's no secret anymore. The Colonel was a gambler. So he would keep a certain amount of money on hand. But these guys didn't have the kind of money that you might think, like they'd have $10, $20 million. No. They were taking projects as they came in because they needed the money. And Elvis couldn't call up and say, "I hate this song." And the Colonel would say, "Well, fine, then fire your whole staff in Memphis and make 2 albums a year and 1 movie and you'll be fine." And Elvis wouldn't do that. So that was the stalemate. It seems like it couldn't happen. Absolutely happened that way.
I think with the movies are real kind of love them or hate them for a lot of fans. And okay, they're not going to win any great critical acclaim for them. But the one thing I always say about the movies is that it's given us hour upon hour of great Elvis film footage. That if you are a fan of other artists of that particular era, it just doesn't exist. I mean, we're very lucky to have all that great Elvis film footage there. Okay, it's the films, some people don't necessarily like them, but if you're a fan of the Beatles, there's not much film footage. They did the few films that they did, but that's it. But we're very lucky that, in a way, the Colonel doing those deals has given us a legacy of Elvis, and that we can continue to see him, and we have that great film footage.
Yeah.
It's very true.
Now, we're talking about deals which came into the office, in the Colonel's office. Can you ever remember, I know the Colonel was a shrewd businessman, but did you ever see anything or hear anything in the office that he turned down that you thought, that's a good deal for us?
The Colonel's job was to turn things down, and a lot of people don't understand that's a management job. He used to say, the artist always wears the white hat. And of course, that was Elvis. He wore the white hat. No matter if he was right or wrong, or if it was Elvis's fault, which didn't happen. That's how it went. The Colonel turned down a lot of deals, and people don't understand. Charlie Stone and I were present when he turned down the Beatles. After Epstein died, they came right to the Colonel to be their manager. And he says, "I can't do it." He says, "I only handle one artist at a time." And I don't know if you all remember when Frank Sinatra retired and he quit working. Well, what had actually happened, since he's long gone now, can't beat me up. He had diverticulitis. I don't know if you know what that is, but he had a colostomy bag put on his side, outside. And he told the world he retired. And he was down in Palm Springs at his compound where we all live. And he was recovering. And, he was off for about a year. And Al Hart from City National Bank called the Colonel and said, "Colonel, would you go down to Frank's compound with me?" He says, "I want to talk to Sinatra." So I drive the Colonel down, and we're sitting by the pool with Frank Sinatra and Al Hart. And Al says, "Frank, we can't carry you anymore. You really need to go back to work." He says, "If you can work, you need to go do something because you have a huge overhead here." Frank Sinatra was a guy that spent a lot of money too. So the Colonel knew that they'd taken off that colostomy bag. So we're all sitting by the pool, and Sinatra says, "I'll go back to work if you manage me, Colonel." He says, "This is it. We've known each other all these years. You manage me. I'll go back to work." And the Colonel said, "I can't do that." He said, "I just can't do it. I only work with Elvis. But I'll introduce you to this guy named Jerry Weintraub." And he said, "I think you should go to Madison Square Garden, and I think you should go in the middle of the boxing ring there and do a show for your comeback and call it the main event." That was the Colonel's idea. And sure enough, he introduced him to Weintraub. They did the show, and then Frank Sinatra went on to another huge comeback career, and when he passed, he left $400 million to his family. So it all worked,
Now, in terms of the international side of things as well, do you remember much coming through the office from projects and deals from overseas, from the UK in particular? Because that's been one of the things which has really divided UK fans about their opinion about the Colonel, is that in the 60s and 70s the Colonel was very hard on not giving us film footage over here. The BBC, ITV would often request it, and the Colonel would demand such huge amounts of money, particularly for the Aloha show, which of course was shown all over the place, but we never got it live here in the UK.
Well, the Colonel used to say, "You want to see Elvis, you got to buy a ticket." And all of the shows, everyone had to buy a ticket. And he was a little tough about that. The UK, the whole issue of going and playing for Elvis to play here was Elvis wouldn't play outdoors. And they always blame it on the Colonel. I know Charlie Stone had arranged to bring Elvis over here to Wembley. But at that time, early on, there really wasn't that many indoor buildings, and Elvis played one place I saw, Tupelo, Mississippi Fair, one time, and after that, if you look at all the shows, Elvis is indoors. He wouldn't play outside. So you couldn't fly over here and do one show. And as far as Elvis coming to Germany or to the UK, and people saying, well, he wouldn't come over here at all because of the Colonel. It's not true. Elvis had a 4-engine jetliner, and all he had to do is tell his crew to set up a trip, maybe a vacation for Priscilla and whoever. He never came over here. He had a giant plane. He didn't need the Colonel's permission to go on vacation. He used to go to Hawaii all the time. Colonel, none of us were going to go on his vacation. He could have been here. He didn't choose to come. He could have done it. He could have flown from Memphis to London and.
Yeah. But not just talking about the live performances, but do you think the Colonel missed a trick by not doing more internationally, marketing Elvis overseas, or did he just feel that the overseas market would just fall into place anyway? They would get the record releases, they would get the films. Because there wasn't a huge amount of marketing that he did in other countries. I know it was a very different time back then. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have technology like we do today, but do you think he missed a trick there that he could have really pushed Elvis more in the international markets?
You know, I think it was a real joint decision with Elvis and the Colonel, because Elvis thought of himself that he knew that he could fly 300 miles and sell out a building and be home at Graceland that night. And, you know, it was well known that they were finally going to do it. It wasn't going to make money, but Charlie knew he was coming over to book the building. And it was going to happen. But the Colonel will live in infamy forever for that. You know, he just will.
Now, throughout the 60s and 70s, working with the Colonel, did you go on the film sets and did you go to the concerts, or were you mainly in the office? Did you get to sort of go to the various places Elvis was performing?
Through the 60s, we were at MGM, and that's where the office was. And on the door of the office, the Colonel's door said, Elvis Exploitation Office. Now that really wouldn't go over well today, but back in that time, every movie studio had what they called the exploitation manager. And that was what we would call now a publicist. You know, the publicist for the studio, but then it was the exploitation officer. Well, that's hard to explain these days too. But I was more in the movie side and just being with the Colonel. And I really never went on the road tours with Charles and Dick and those guys. I went to Las Vegas for all the shows. I went to Lake Tahoe. I went to Southern California dates. But I was pretty much, and then I started managing Ricky Nelson. You know, after I got out of the Army, you know, I started managing Ricky Nelson, and that was 17 years. So I would go back and visit Elvis and the Colonel and back and forth, and these guys have been my friends forever. They're somewhat older than I am, but
When you get rid of them, they just keep following you around.
Wait a minute, let's check that. Who said we were your friends? Yeah, right. Where did you come up with that?
So, actually, that leads nicely on to my next question, which is slightly moving away from Elvis and the Colonel, about your other interest in the entertainment industry, and particularly Ricky Nelson. So how did that come about? How did you go from working with Elvis and the Colonel and then managing Ricky Nelson?
when the Colonel didn't have anything for me to do, and Elvis wasn't around for me to build another room, I started promoting concerts. And I had bought Rick Nelson for some shows there in Southern California. And we got to know each other, and I became his manager, and we had a great run. Rick was a great guy. And Rick and Elvis were good friends. People don't understand that they were in the 50s. Ricky was already a big star because of the television show Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, which really never played over here. And I have a clip of Paul McCartney saying, he says, you know, we knew Ricky as a rockabilly singer, and we loved him, and the Beatles loved him. And he said, if Elvis was the king of rock and roll, then Ricky was certainly the crown prince. They loved him. But they didn't know who Ozzie and Harriet was. He had the rest of the family, which was big in the United States. So, but Elvis and Rick were friendly rivals. They had football teams. So on Sundays in Beverly Hills, Elvis had challenged Ricky to a football game with his friends. So everybody shows up down in this park in Beverly Hills. Elvis has got jerseys on that say Elvis Presley Enterprises on them. He has jerseys and cheerleaders and a bus. And Rick shows up in his jeans. You know, this is supposed to be flag football. They played for years on Sunday, and people didn't know it. People didn't realize that those two were friends. They were both chasing the same girls, and that was a dozen girls in Hollywood. And that was, you know, and then Elvis, of course, was starting to have chart records, just one right after another. Well, Ricky was too. You know, all the fans in America knew Rick from the TV show because he'd been on the radio since he was 9. And everybody knew Ricky. We grew up with him, and, you know. And so there's this competition going on. Rick would have a hit single, Elvis had taken him off the charts, and they were fighting and fighting through 1958. They were like somewhat neck and neck.